Introduction: Beyond the Myth of the Axe. This video will focus not on the usual superficial Viking military campaigns that we see in every Hollywood production, but on the other side of the coin, Scandinavian social life, culture, and how these people carved out a huge, indelible place for themselves in the dusty pages of history. To understand the complex mechanisms behind this society, often labeled simply as barbaric plunderers, we need to go back much further than the first raid on Lindisfarne. We must return to 350 A.D., the critical turning point where the migration period began. When the migration of people started, most Germanic tribes, driven by climate change, famine, or the pressure of other tribes, flocked to the riches of Rome and into the interior of Europe. However, not every Germanic tribe joined this massive migratory caravan. Those North Germanic tribes that remained in the rugged mountains, deep fjords, and freezing cold of the north, Scandinavia, continued to settle and consolidate in the region. Geographically, Scandinavia served as a natural barrier against Hun invasions, which were wreaking havoc across the rest of the continent. While the Huns were tearing down the gates of empires, the northern tribes were protected by the Baltic Sea and the Scandinavian mountain ranges. Its fish-rich seas and timber-filled forests made it an ideal location for the North Germanic peoples to develop a lifestyle uniquely adapted to their environment. While their cousins, the Visigoths, Vandals, and Angles, raided Rome, settled in Britain, and even reached the coasts of Spain, the North Germanic tribes remained in Scandinavia. There, they developed their own unique culture and civilization. While Germanic tribes like the Scots, Angles, and Vandals settled in former Roman lands, assimilated with the local populations, adopted Christianity, and gradually lost their ancestral identities, the Vikings remained in their homeland, preserving their own ancient beliefs, strict legal systems, and a culture that would remain stubbornly pagan for centuries. They did not melt into the Roman pot. On the contrary, they forged their own distinct metonyet that would eventually burst forth onto the world stage with explosive force. Chapter 1. The Etymology and Identity of the Viking. So, what is the origin of the word Viking? This is a question that has occupied historians for centuries, although its exact meaning is still a subject of academic debate. Written Scandinavian sources suggest that it refers to an activity rather than a race. In Old Norse, the word Vikingar directly meant piracy, or a person going on a pirate raid. It was a job description. A man was not born a Viking, he went on a Viking. One could be a farmer during the winter and then go Viking when the spring thaws arrived. Another compelling theory suggests that Viking comes from the word vikja, meaning a traveler or one who has strayed from the path. Furthermore, the word vik in Old Norse means a small bay or an inlet in a fjord, precisely the places where these raiders hid their ships before striking. The outside world, however, named them according to their own experiences and the window through which they were seen. Slavic sources call them Rus, from which Russia derives its name. This term essentially meant rowers, acknowledging the sheer physical labor and naval skill required to navigate the great river systems of Eastern Europe. The world's largest country today literally takes its name from these northern seafarers. Anglo-Saxon chronicles often refer to them collectively as Danes or Danes. From the perspective of an English monk in 800 A.D., Any blond-haired man with an axe coming from the north was Danish, and they felt little need to differentiate between the various complex kingdoms of Scandinavia. Only the Irish made a subtle distinction, calling the Norwegians Fingal, or whites, white foreigners, and the Danes Dubgale, or black foreigners. This likely referred to the color of their hair or the type of armor they wore. Foreigners gave them different names. The Danes were also called Dabgale, while the Franks called them Northmen, northern men, which eventually led to the name of the Normandy region. This region would later become a powerhouse that would radically change the course of European history. In short, not all Vikings came from a single kingdom or country. There were many different kingdoms in Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, but they would occasionally come together for raids or invasions, either as a unified great heathen army or in small opportunistic groups from individual settlements. Chapter 2. The Myth of Geographical Ignorance. So if these men were of North Germanic origin and had deep ties to the tribes that moved south, why weren't their cousins, the Franks and Saxons, aware of them until the raids began? Of course they were aware. It is a historical absurdity to think otherwise. Why else would the Saxons suddenly start calling these northern people Danes if they were a complete mystery? In this regard, the popular Vikings television series made a huge, glaring mistake for the sake of drama. There is a scene where Ragnar Lodbrok encounters a merchant and acts as if he's utterly shocked to hear of other lands. Is there such a thing as an island called Britain? Is there such a thing as Europe? Wow! Unbelievable. That was absolutely not the case. The Vikings were part of a vast northern trade network. They knew exactly where Britain and Central Europe were, and more importantly, they knew exactly what was there. The Anglo-Saxon and Frankish kingdoms were not mythical lands to them. They were known quantities. So if they knew about these lands, why did they wait until the end of the 8th century to strike? Why did they appear specifically in that century? Simply put, for a long time, they didn't need to go west. The southern trade routes through the Russian river systems, the Dnieper and the Volga, were much easier and more established. These routes gave them direct access to the Silk Road of Central Asia and the wealth of the Byzantine Empire. They already had a steady flow of silver, silk, and spices. However, the situation changed dramatically in the 7th and 8th centuries. First, there was a massive population explosion in Scandinavia. The arable land was limited, and the existing farms could no longer support the growing number of sons. Furthermore, the re-centralization of the Carolingian Empire under the reign of Charlemagne, who dominated much of Western Europe, strengthened trade routes in the West. As the wealth in these regions increased, so did the number of those who coveted it. Suddenly, the risk of crossing the North Sea became worth the potential reward. Chapter 3. The Engine of Expansion, Shipbuilding Technology. On top of all this, the technology behind Scandinavia's iconic Viking ships was also highly advanced. These ships were not just boats, they were masterpieces of engineering that allowed for the transition from coastal navigation to deep-sea exploration. Previously confined to coastal waters and rivers, the Vikings perfected the clinker-built technique, overlapping wooden planks to create a flexible, light, yet incredibly strong hull. These ships could bend with the waves rather than breaking against them. These ships were essentially the engine of their expansion. For the Turks, this engine was the horse of the Central Asian steppes. a topic I covered extensively in my Gokturk video. For the Vikings, the ship was their horse. They developed the shallow-keeled longship, which could sail across the ocean but also navigate rivers just a few feet deep. This meant they could land on a beach, row up a river, attack a city miles inland, and be back at sea before any local army could muster a defense. They also had knarrs, wider and deeper ships designed specifically for trade and transporting livestock to colonies like Iceland and Greenland. Their shipbuilding techniques were truly advanced, using iron rivets and waterproofed wool and tar sealants that made them the fastest and most maneuverable vessels of the Middle Ages. Chapter 4. The Double Life of a Viking. Social Stratification. Despite their wild popular culture imagery as bloodthirsty warriors, most Vikings were merchants, fishermen, farmers, or artisans, yet they led double lives. Most Vikings spent the long, dark winters at home, repairing tools, weaving cloth, and tending to their livestock. But when spring arrived and the crops were sown, the younger and more ambitious men would go on raids, a highly logical strategy. In the 800s, with agricultural technology still primitive, the harsh Scandinavian climate meant you could often only grow enough crops to feed your own family. To become truly rich, you had to plunder and seize what others produced. Like most agricultural societies, the Viking world was quite hierarchical. At the top was the king, konungur. However, unlike the absolute monarchs of the East, a Viking king's power was not divine. It was based on his strength, his ability to distribute wealth, and the loyalty of his men. If a king failed to provide victory and gold, he could be replaced. Below the king were the jarls, a noble aristocracy who served as military leaders and controlled vast lands. They were the regional lords who organized raids and maintained their own private war bands of huskarl. Below the jarls were the free peasant farmers known as bondi. These free farmers formed the largest and most powerful class in society. They were the backbone of the economy and the primary source of manpower for the raids. In fact, it was the hunger of the bondi for land and wealth that drove the Vikings to explore. In Viking society, your status was defined by wealth and renown, fame, not just by your family line or profession as it was in the rigid feudal systems of Western Europe. This fueled the free Vikings' appetite for more plunder. If a bondi pulled off a successful raid, he could buy more land, hire more workers, and eventually become a jarl himself, elevating his entire family's status. But in Europe, you're just a serf, son. What's the point of going to war for your lord? Even if you fought, the knights would take all the credit and the plunder, leaving you with nothing. And where would a serf even get a sword or a spear? In Viking society, however, the law dictated that every free man was entitled to a share of the loot. You kept most of what you took. At the very bottom of the social pyramid were the slaves, known as thralls. They were valued only slightly above animals, doing the hardest labor in the fields. However, even a thrall could sometimes earn their freedom through extreme loyalty or bravery, a concept almost alien to the slave systems of later centuries. Chapter 5. The Iron Ladies of the North. Yet, despite being a male-dominated warrior-centric society, women enjoyed far greater freedom in Scandinavia than in places like Wessex, Mercia, or the Frankish Empire. For instance, when a man left for months at a time to raid or trade, he would hand his wife the house key in a symbolic gesture. This small public ceremony was crucial It legally transferred total authority over his property, his lands, and his household to her. While he was away, she was the lord of the manor. Women also held the keys to chests containing a family's most prized possessions: gold, silver, and ancestral heirlooms. They had the right to own property independently and to inherit from both their fathers and their husbands. Most strikingly, for the time, they could initiate a divorce. If a husband was abusive or failed to provide, a woman could call witnesses to her doorstep and declare herself divorced, keeping a significant share of the household property. From what we learn in the sagas and the archaeological evidence found in graves, these Norse women weren't exactly delicate or refined in the Victorian sense. Take blood feuds, for example. Women often took on the role of insiders, reminding their sons and husbands of unpaid debts of honor and pushing them toward violence. They joined raids themselves, the famous shield maidens, skjaldmær, and they were the final line of defense for the village. When the men were gone, it was the women who fought off marauders. These were women you really didn't want to cross. Chapter 6. The Ting, Law in a Land of Violence. Under Viking law, even the most powerful king couldn't just rule by personal whim. They had a governing assembly called the Ting, or Thing, which is likely the origin of the English word ring, referring to the circular gathering of people. Every region had its own local ting, where major decisions, such as going to war or allocating land, were put to a vote. Women were allowed to attend these assemblies and make their voices heard, though in most regions they couldn't cast a formal vote. The tings also functioned as high courts. Opposing parties would present their cases publicly before the community. There were law speakers who had memorized the entire oral legal code and would recite the relevant laws for the case. A verdict was then decided by popular vote or a jury of peers. However, there was a catch. The ting lacked a central police force to enforce its rulings. If the ting found you guilty and ordered you to pay a fine, it was up to the plaintiff to collect it. Defiance, however, carried serious weight. You could be declared an outlaw, meaning you were no longer protected by the law. Anyone could kill an outlaw without penalty, and your property could be seized. This forced most people to comply. In the case of blood feuds, the most common cause of legal disputes, family leaders could seek a swift resolution before the ting by demanding a duel, holmgang, or proposing a blood price, vergild. In Viking society, paying a blood price was considered one of the more civilized solutions. If a dispute wasn't brought before the ting, both parties would fight to the death to wipe out the other's family entirely. Violence was endemic in Viking society. Even in Denmark, which was a union of 3 Scandinavian peoples, the king held no absolute power because there were no rigid systems like a theocracy or serfdom to keep the populace in check. As a result, violence became not just accepted, but a formalized institution for resolving conflict. For comparison, imagine you're a farmer in France in 840 A.D. If your neighbor steals your horse, you go to the sheriff or the Lord Steward, and they handle the legalities. Or if 2 nobles have a dispute, they go to the king. But in Scandinavia, if someone steals your horse, there's no sheriff to turn to. Even if you go to the local jarl, he might just mock you, saying, "Hey, boy, go get your horse back yourself." So you have to find the thief, behead him, and reclaim your horse. Do you have to kill them? Not necessarily, but if you do nothing when someone steals from you, it's seen as a fatal weakness. The thief will soon go after your other belongings, then your fields, and eventually your family. To survive, you had to be willing to use force and tell everyone why you used it. Otherwise, you'd find yourself in a never-ending blood feud. Chapter 7. Evolutionary Consequences